Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Global Hotspots podcast. I'm your host for today, Eugene Chausovsky, and I'll be talking to my colleagues Andrew Loftusness and Milos Majori about some of the key developments this week related to geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. As always, you can find a more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics in our weekly forecast monitor that publishes every Friday alongside this podcast. So today we're going to start off with a brief roundup of all the major developments happening in each of the global hotspots, including the Middle East, Indo-Pacific, and Russia-Ukraine, as well as take a look at some developments outside of those hotspots in the DRC, Mali, and Pakistan. We'll then go into a bit of a deeper discussion on developments in the Indo-Pacific and their links to the Iran war, as well as what to expect from OPEC countries as the UAE shifts its positioning. So let's jump into our roundup. Andrew, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Sounds good. Thank you, Eugene. Let's start off with Russia and Ukraine, where the status quo has held. Russia proposed a temporary ceasefire during the May 9 Victory Day celebrations in Moscow. Zelensky said that he will seek clarification on Moscow's exact intentions before agreeing to the offer, and counter-proposed with a long-term ceasefire. Meanwhile, a Kremlin official confirmed that Putin and Trump held a 90-minute phone call on April 29 to discuss security matters related to both Iran and Ukraine. The U.S. Department of Defense released a $400 million aid package for Ukraine, while Trump said that the U.S. is considering a reduction of its troop presence in Germany, amid an ongoing diplomatic spat with senior German officials. Israel, meanwhile, announced that it will not allow a Russian vessel carrying grain from occupied territories of Ukraine to unload in Haifa following threats of sanctions from Kyiv. Turning now to the Middle East, the region trended toward military escalation as Trump rejected the latest peace proposal from Iran and received briefings from the commander of U.S. CENTCOM on options to resume an offensive air campaign inside Iran, according to reporting from both Axios and the Wall Street Journal. Meanwhile, Trump is ordering CENTCOM to sustain an extended naval blockade against Iranian ports. Lithuanian President Gitanas Nausėda said that he is supportive of joining U.S. freedom of navigation operations in the Strait of Hormuz and is presenting a U.S. security proposal to Lithuania's State Defense Council. Meanwhile, on April 27th, Putin hosted Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi in Moscow for consultations on peace efforts with the U.S. Israel resumed strikes north of the Litani River in Lebanon, and on April 28th, the UAE announced that it was exiting from OPEC. Milos, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. So indeed, in the Indo-Pacific, we saw a trend towards the hybrid escalation scenario as the United States sanctioned Chinese purchases of Iranian oil, warning of more sanctions in the banking sector if those purchases continue. China, on its end, blocked the acquisition by Meta of the Chinese-founded AI company Manus, citing concerns with the technology transfer process. In the United States, House Democrats sent a letter to the Trump administration urging him to maintain safeguards against Chinese electric vehicle imports, while China indicated that discussions with the EU on electric vehicle imports into the bloc were progressing well. Taiwan received its final order of previously purchased Abrams tanks from the United States, while also preparing for a Coast Guard overhaul to deal with increasing grey zone threats from China, as China has been pressuring the United States to change its wording regarding Taiwanese independence. Shifting now to the rest of the world, some of the other notable developments that we've been keeping an eye on involve Afghanistan and Pakistan, where Pakistani troops struck Taliban outposts in Afghanistan, including in the country's Balochistan province, as Afghan officials claim that Pakistan has repeatedly hit civilian homes, as well as a university in the country, wounding more than 80 people and killing 7. Pakistan denies these claims, and the developments come despite recent talks mediated by China, in which both sides agreed not to escalate the conflict. In Mali, Russia's Africa Corps, formerly known as the Wagner Group, was attacked by the Tuareg Azawad Liberation Front and other al-Qaeda-affiliated organizations in the northern town of Kidal and was forced to withdraw. Mali's defense minister, General Sadio Kamara, was killed during the attacks. And finally, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the US is co-funding a $100 million initiative by the DRC's General Inspectorate of Mines to set up a paramilitary unit to safeguard the country's mining sector which holds vast amounts of critical minerals vital to the supply chains of multiple industrial sectors. This marks a challenge to China, which holds a dominant mining position in the country and follows last year's partnership signed by the DRC and US on cooperating in the critical minerals sector.
Great, thank you both. So now let's pivot back to a deeper dive on developments in the Indo-Pacific, as well as their links to the Middle East. So as you mentioned in your briefing, Miloš, the U.S. actually sanctioned this week a Chinese oil importer for its ties to Iran. So let's start with that. What is your sense of what's going on there?
Well, this is an interesting moment where I think we're seeing the intersection of both the Indo-Pacific and the Middle East as theaters in this blend of hybrid escalation and military escalation. Now, obviously, we know that the United States has been keeping up its pressure campaign against Iran, specifically on the military side of things, as you guys both well know, including with the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. On the Chinese front, it's no secret that China is one of the biggest importers of Iranian oil and fuel. And as a result, part of the US's pressure campaign is to ratchet up some of the pressure on China, indirectly affecting Iran. And late last week, this was the Department of the Treasury in the US. It issued a sanction against a petrochemical refinery organization in China, which is actually China's largest private oil refiner. So obviously that targeted a very large, well-connected player in the industry. But it wasn't just the sanctions themselves. Obviously, then Trump came out and, backing up his claim, said that this would just be the first of many if China continued its purchases of Iranian oil. And specifically, as I mentioned, he was targeting or threatening to sanction the banking sector itself that helps these kind of organizations, these kind of plants from moving money across as these purchases are made. So definitely just an interesting development. And I mean, we can talk about it more as we go on, but the date to keep in mind here, as always, is the upcoming summit between the US and China. So we know that the US doesn't want to put too much pressure on China, but definitely wants to come in with some pressure levers ready to be actioned if needed.
Miloš, what's your sense of, kind of on that last point there, how much pain do you think the Trump administration has the stomach to, economic pain, of course, to inflict upon China right now, as you mentioned, with the upcoming summit, and then again with the Trump administration's economic policy? We always have to ask, for how long, right? Do you think, for example, like in their calculations right now, the Chinese are betting that even if the U.S. is willing to step up the pressure, let's say even significantly, that Trump might reverse course in short order?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I think, so obviously China has the ability to withstand this pressure, including these most recent sanctions. And I mean, to give you an idea, China holds, I believe, one of the largest oil stockpiles in the world. And obviously it is therefore well prepared to withstand some of these moves. However, there's a limit to how much China is willing to accept before a summit in which there's a lot on the line, from trade to the status of Taiwan. So I think, the US is coming into this wanting to end the war in Iran, presumably as fast as possible. That's my take on it. And I think that it wants to show that it is able to manage multiple levers in it, not just directly against Iran and, going via China as well. And I think that possibly trying to convince China to take a more active role in, perhaps stopping, certain things, like China has been providing weapons systems to Iran in the past couple of weeks. So, that's something that Trump has obviously said that he wanted to avoid from happening. So this could be a way to get around that. But also we know that this could be, a way of establishing a quid pro quo in a sense, as we know that China has got a significant amount of leverage in terms of the economic damage it can and is willing to do against the United States if it wants to. So that's my take on it. You got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's really interesting, Milos. And then, again, with this summit coming up, and it's something that you've been talking about for a while now, we know that both when it comes to dealings and diplomacy with the United States right now and personally with President Trump, that traditional allies and adversaries of the United States rely on pre-existing relationships with the president, right? Between their own heads of state, or if not, they try to cultivate that. We see that all the time, with the French and the British, I would say in a very peculiar way with Vladimir Putin as well. Is there any sort of effort like that from Beijing, or have they not really altered their approach to diplomacy with the United States, specifically within the context of trying to de-escalate the war in Iran?
I mean, I'm sure that there are things happening beyond what is given in the headlines to that effect, especially with regards, between the two heads of state. Trump and Xi always talk about, or rather, Trump always talks about having a great relationship with President Xi. Every time that they do meet, that is the sort of messaging that we do get from the US president. We haven't heard any overt, attempts by the Chinese to that effect. And you mentioned the UK. I presume you mean the sending over of King Charles, which certainly in the UK was very well or was seen as a very class act in diplomacy. But from the Chinese side, not really. I think, there's some things that China can do that to that effect. And to give you an example, we got some US customs data with regards to the outflow from China of rare earth elements, which apparently during the course of March have actually increased. And this was not always the case. We've had some months since their previous meeting in October where you had a bit more, a bit less, but it seems that the trend is on the upwards, despite sometimes China coming in and threatening otherwise. But certainly that's something that I believe the Chinese government is willing to keep going in order to, show a demonstration of good faith at the moment.
Yeah, so it's interesting, you bring up, Milos, a lot of notable diplomacy happening right now, obviously in the lead up to this big Trump and Xi sit down in May. I will note here that we've seen some other activity that was mentioned, kind of up top in the brief. We had actually Trump and Putin having a phone call this week to talk about the Iran conflict, as well as some related things on Ukraine. And then we had that visit of Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi to Russia, which I think, can be interpreted at least as a leverage play on the Iranian front, especially as we're seeing the ongoing negotiations, but sort of a stalemate at this point when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz reopening, continued U.S. threats. So I'm curious to hear from you, Milos, and maybe you as well, Andrew. How do you see this kind of global and great power competition and the associated diplomacy shaping both what we're seeing happening in the Iranian theater, but also the connection to China?
I mean, I think Andrew put his finger on an element of it, which is definitely the personal relationship aspect. And, you mentioned President Putin there, who clearly Trump doesn't want to be seen as having a negative relationship in that regard. It was interesting to me to hear that Trump seems to have put down efforts by Vladimir Putin to get involved in the Iranian war. That's my understanding, at least, that Trump replied by saying, let's focus on, you can help us by focusing on the war in Ukraine, which certainly raised an eyebrow on my end. I mean, Andrew, you've been following the relationship between those two leaders a lot more than I. You got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, to go off that last quote that you were kind of paraphrasing there. So that was from a call between Putin and Trump as you said, like right after the war in Iran kicked off, and Putin offered, if you have a problem in Iran, let me know, and maybe I can help you. And then the reporting is that Trump replied by saying, I have basically a you problem. If you want to help me, you can end the war in Ukraine. Basically, in other words, saying, as you pointed out, Milos, like, stay out of this.
I have two thoughts on that regard. And the first being that it seems to me that Russia this week was also having some trouble on the oil front with a lot of Ukrainian strikes. I mean, this has been an ongoing campaign, but it seemed to me that there's been a particular increase this week of Ukrainian strikes against oil refineries. And then the second thing that I definitely would want to hear your thoughts on, both of you, is the situation with the UAE. Like, what does it mean now that the UAE has made this decision to just withdraw from the organization?
Yeah, the UAE move to leave OPEC is an interesting one. I will note it's not completely unexpected, because we know that there's been some disputes or some tensions between the UAE and Saudi Arabia on this issue. Especially over things like pricing and inventory levels. That kind of goes back quite a ways in terms of what their preferences are on those things. But something that's been obviously exacerbated by this conflict in Iran and the associated essential closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which, as we talked about, is still, despite that ceasefire agreement between the U.S. and Iran, is functionally closed at this point. Though, Iran did weigh some options to reopen it, kind of moving the nuclear issue to the side, which the U.S. is not interested in, at least at this time. So it just goes to show, as you mentioned, Milos, there's a lot of pressure on energy markets. Most notably in the Strait of Hormuz, but also, as you said, in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Yeah, it's not new that Ukraine is targeting Russian energy infrastructure, and obviously that happens on the other side as well, with Russia continuously targeting Ukraine's infrastructure. But their capabilities have grown. They're basically able to utilize, drone capabilities and other things to strike kind of increasingly deeper into Russia. And so, we've seen actually, and maybe Andrew, you have some thoughts on this, how Ukraine, because of the sort of stalemate on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the U.S. now is much more distracted and focused on the Middle East, that Ukraine has been trying to sort of increase its own leverage and increase its own positioning, both with those attacks, on Russia, but also getting more involved in the Middle East and offering some of its services and capabilities to those very Gulf countries that we were talking about, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So it's a really interesting kind of connection of all of these different theaters, and the countries trying to basically position and leverage themselves in order to shape them.
Yeah, definitely. And, in Eugene, you're kind of just hinting at this. Wars have a way of hitting fast forward on processes that were already underway, right? So we're seeing this, we're seeing the UAE do this right now, pulling out of multilateral institutions. We're seeing a European version of that with the U.S. in NATO, right? Or perhaps I should say a U.S. version of that. But to bring it back sort of to the original question of how is this war impacting international diplomacy, again, to your point, Ukraine has really taken advantage of a crisis, so to speak, right? They have not let this crisis go to waste. And something we've been talking about for the last year plus really is, the Ukrainians are trying, and I would say they are succeeding, positioning themselves as not only a capable security partner in Europe, but the security partner of choice. Again, especially within the context of as we mentioned in the brief, with Trump is considering at least a reduction of U.S. force presence in Germany as the U.S. steps back from sort of its traditional multilateral responsibilities with these institutions. Now, though, because of the war in Iran, we're also seeing that play out with Ukraine in the Middle East, which I don't think was quite on anyone's radar before February 28th when the war kicked off. But there's no question that, especially when it comes to drone defense and I'm sure offense as well, in particular, that the Ukrainians have really succeeded in positioning themselves as the partner of choice, certainly in the Gulf right now. And we're seeing that play out at home. From the Ukrainian perspective, they've expanded their domestic defense production capabilities significantly since the start of the invasion. And as you mentioned, Eugene, we're starting to see what that looks like with the expansion and really the intensification of Ukraine's long-running campaign against Russian energy infrastructure.
So yeah, I think what we're seeing here, as we're discussing, there's a lot of these different negotiation processes underway, whether it's, what you mentioned up at the top, Miloš, between the US and China, those upcoming talks between Trump and Xi. We've got the ongoing discussions on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and of course the negotiations over the conflict in Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. But what we're essentially seeing, as those discussions are happening but not really making any breakthroughs, is all of these various players basically show their leverage, whether that be through, these drone attacks that we've talked about from Ukraine on Russia's energy infrastructure, Iran showing its diplomatic, weight by going to Russia, Russia leveraging that in its talks with Putin, with its talks with Trump and vice versa. So a very kind of interconnected dynamic here. Some of these conflicts are obviously more ongoing, like the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and others, have been short but very intense, like those in Iran. So we'll have to see if any of those things actually lead to any breakthroughs. I mean, perhaps in the Iranian conflict in particular, anytime soon. But certainly right now, I think the leverage plays, through those military and hybrid capabilities are certainly on display. I wanted to take it back, Miloš, to the Indo-Pacific here, because I know we've been talking about, the U.S.-China context, but I think it's worth bringing in Taiwan here, which, not directly related, but obviously factors very much, especially into that upcoming meeting between Trump and Xi. So what's kind of on your radar from what you mentioned up in the briefing, and what we should be looking out for, in these next coming weeks ahead of that Trump and Xi sit down?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a few things to keep an eye on, and it should be said that for these next couple of weeks, I will definitely be repeating the fact that this summit is what a lot of what I'm about to say is hanging on, and there's no doubt of it. And it's no coincidence the fact that yes, we've got the summit coming up in a couple of weeks between Trump and Xi. But if you remember from our previous episodes, the last couple of weeks, China was entertaining the leadership of Taiwan's main opposition party, the KMT. Now, that is not necessarily, an unlinked situation. We talked about in the previous episodes how, in part, this is going to create some division within Taiwan, which will have its ramifications on whether or not Taiwan is able to pass its defense budgets that the US has actually been pushing it to do. But on the whole, Taiwan is going to be central in these summit negotiations. We even got confirmation from China that they are very keen to be talking about Taiwan with President Trump, which is definitely something that, in the US has been less so the case from the Trump administration. We know that they are usually more concerned with the trade relationship, maintaining that. All of last year was dealt with tariffs. To give you that example, undoubtedly these sanctions that I mentioned up top will come up as well. But we've gotten so far as even hearing from China that there's a lot of pressure on trying to get the United States to shift its tone on Taiwan. Now, there's a whole bunch of legislation in place within the United States which dictates its policy towards Taiwan. And at the moment, this very specific wording dictating that, including the US not supporting any Taiwanese attempts at independence. And China is very keen to try and get the United States to change that from not supporting it to actually opposing it. And I think that is going to be a probe, this summit, that is going to see whether or not China is able to keep the United States' attention perhaps more focused on, trade relations and sorting out the situation in Iran so as to make these, small but nonetheless significant moves with regards to Taiwan. So, yeah, I mean, very much central to this conversation.
Got it. Thanks, Milos. So yeah, lots to track there, as the US and China sit down approaches, both on the Taiwan front, but also everything that we've linked these discussions to from the Iran conflict to the ongoing situation in Russia and Ukraine. And so we're seeing a lot of both diplomatic activity, but as I said, all of that is kind of shaped both on the battlefield and in the hybrid dimension that we will for sure continue to monitor. But with that, we'll have to wrap it up for today. As a reminder to our listeners, if you'd like more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to the topics that we discussed, please check out the weekly forecast monitor on our website at newlinesinstitute.org, where you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter and access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for real-time updates and analysis around the world. Thank you, Milos. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you all for listening, and take care.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.